Welcome to This Explainer. When we look back at the 47 presidencies of the United States, it's so easy to just see this long chronological list of names, dates, and those serious historical portraits. But honestly, that's missing the real story. Today, we're going to completely reframe how we look at the Oval Office. We're not just looking at a timeline here. We're diving into a fascinating, really high-stakes study of leadership during defining national crises. Because every single commander-in-chief steps into a totally unique storm, and how they navigate that storm, well, that shapes the very fabric of the country. To make sense of all of this, we've broken it down into 5 key eras. We'll start with the early Republic survival, then move into the Civil War and Reconstruction, tackle the Depression and World Wars, navigate the Cold War, and finally, look at modern crises and divides. All right, let's dive right into our first era, the early Republic survival, focusing on establishing and expanding a new nation.
Think about those early days for a second. Failure wasn't just a bad poll number or a political setback. It literally meant the total collapse of the whole democratic experiment. George Washington couldn't just sit behind a desk. He had to actively establish federal power from scratch and prove that a peaceful transfer of power was actually possible. And right after him, John Adams used some incredibly careful diplomacy to dodge a major, devastating war with France, a war the young nations simply couldn't afford. Then jump to 1812. James Madison, the guy known as the father of the Constitution, suddenly finds himself leading the country in a second war against Great Britain just to permanently secure American independence. It was a constant, high-wire balancing act on the world stage.
So once that immediate survival was locked down, the crisis kind of shifted, right? It became about foreign encroachment. And that brings us to the Monroe Doctrine under our 5th president, James Monroe. This was a bold move. It explicitly warned European powers, hey, stay out of the Americas. By drawing that massive line in the sand, Monroe basically established the U.S. as a true sovereign power, and it actually ushered in this rare period of national unity that historians call the era of good feelings. But that focus on survival, it quickly evolved into a relentless drive for expansion, really fueled by this idea of manifest destiny. James K. Polk was a huge champion of this. Under his watch, the U.S. fought the Mexican-American War and gained California and massive chunks of the Southwest. But here's the absolutely crucial takeaway. While this solved the problem of territorial limits, it violently accelerated a super dangerous internal crisis. Because expanding the borders meant expanding the debate over slavery. It was basically setting a ticking time bomb for the whole nation. Which brings us to Section 2, Civil War and Reconstruction, the ultimate internal crisis. Now the threat completely shifts from external European empires to a deeply divided, fracturing nation right at home. Just look at this number, 31 days. Let that sink in for a second. That is the entire length of William Henry Harrison's term as the 9th president before he tragically died of an illness. And that incredibly short term, which was followed pretty soon after by Zachary Taylor's brief 16 months in office, it perfectly captures the immense instability of this era. The leadership at the top was basically a revolving door, exactly when the country was desperately hurtling toward its darkest hour over the conflict of slavery. Now, what's really interesting here is the sharp, undeniable contrast in how 2 consecutive presidents handled this ultimate national crisis. Let's look at James Buchanan. His presidency came right before the war, and he essentially struggled helplessly as southern states actively moved towards secession. Historically, his inaction is largely viewed as a massive failure to prevent the coming conflict. But then you look at Abraham Lincoln. Plunged right into the Civil War, Lincoln took decisive, totally unprecedented action to preserve the Union and issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which began the end of slavery. It's wild to think about. One president buckled under the crisis, and the very next one completely reshaped the nation through it. But of course, the crisis didn't just magically vanish when the war ended. The post-war Reconstruction era demanded incredibly intense leadership. Andrew Johnson took over after Lincoln's assassination, but his chaotic leadership met fierce congressional opposition, and he actually became the first president to be impeached. Contrast that with Ulysses S. Grant, the Union general turned president. Grant used the sheer power of the presidency to actively support civil rights for African Americans and physically fight back against the Ku Klux Klan. The crisis of a torn nation required immense strength, and honestly, their approaches couldn't have been more different. Moving on to Section 3, Depression and World Wars, Navigating Global Threats. So the nation survives its internal fractures, only to be violently thrown onto the global stage. We're talking economic collapse and total warfare threatening the very fabric of society. Talk about historical whiplash. In just a few decades, you've got Woodrow Wilson leading the nation through the unprecedented scale of World War I, trying to build international cooperation. Then boom, a quick pivot to the 1920s where Calvin Coolidge brings stability, limited government, and huge business growth. But that prosperity, it crashes instantly in the 1930s. Herbert Hoover faces the catastrophic Great Depression and gets hit with immense criticism. And right on the heels of that economic disaster, Franklin D. Roosevelt takes the reins, leading the nation straight out of the Depression and into the absolute inferno of World War II. Speaking of FDR, we absolutely have to highlight how he handled that massive economic collapse. His response was the New Deal. And this wasn't just a minor policy tweak, it was an unprecedented sweeping reshaping of the federal government and American society. He utilized immense government action to stabilize the economy. He essentially proved that in times of absolute rock-bottom crisis, the presidency could expand its reach to provide direct relief and reform to the American people. Let's shift gears to Section 4, navigating the Cold War into the nuclear age. Emerging from World War II as a global superpower, the United States faced a whole new set of crises. Ideological standoffs, the space race, and the ever-present, literally terrifying threat of global nuclear annihilation. Managing the Cold War required a really complex, multi-pronged approach from several presidents. Harry S. Truman kicked things off by making the vital decision to support the rebuilding of Europe to stop the spread of communism. Dwight D. Eisenhower leaned heavily on his military background to promote stability and massively strengthen defense. John Kennedy had to navigate the most intense standoff of them all, the Cuban Missile Crisis, while simultaneously inspiring the nation with the space program. And later on, Richard Nixon used strategic diplomacy to suddenly improve relations with both China and the Soviet Union. It was just a constant high-wire act balancing sheer military defense with very delicate diplomacy. But while the Cold War raged globally, domestic crises were completely boiling over back home. Lyndon B. Johnson found himself managing two massive battlefronts at once. Internally, he launched the Great Society. This was a sprawling set of social programs and major civil rights laws aimed directly at fighting poverty and racial injustice. But concurrently, his presidency was largely defined and heavily weighed down by the highly divisive and escalating crisis of the Vietnam War. It's a pretty stark reminder that presidents are rarely, if ever, afforded the luxury of dealing with just one crisis at a time.
And that brings us to Section 5, Modern Crises and Divides, Navigating a Complex New World.
As we look at our more recent leaders, let's take a step back and impartially observe how they've handled a totally new breed of threats. We're talking everything from modern terrorism and massive financial crashes to incredibly deep political and social divisions. And the mechanisms used to combat these crises have been super varied. George H.W. Bush faced the end of the Cold War and the Gulf War by utilizing diplomacy to build these really broad, effective international coalitions. His son, George W. Bush, was forced to respond to these sudden, horrific attacks of 9/11, leading him to launch the global war on terror, which fundamentally shifted American foreign policy. Then Barack Obama stepped into the Oval Office right in the middle of the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression and focused his efforts on economic recovery, clean energy, and passing major healthcare reform. And this brilliantly illustrates the reality of our current moment. Looking at our most recent administrations, we see entirely different lenses for viewing and solving modern American challenges. Joe Biden, our 46th president, has focused heavily on domestic infrastructure, economic recovery, and strengthening traditional international alliances. Conversely, Donald Trump, the 45th and 47th president, champions an America First foreign policy, focusing heavily on immigration control, domestic economic strength, and aggressively tackling global competition. Regardless of politics, what we're objectively seeing here are two fundamentally different philosophies on exactly how the presidency should function in a world characterized by fierce global competition and sharp internal political divisions. So, what does this all mean? The crucial point to take away from this explainer is that the American presidency is not just a desk, it is the ultimate crisis management role. From Washington establishing federal survival, to Lincoln saving the Union, to FDR battling the Depression, and modern leaders navigating a really polarized, complex world, the crises are cyclical, but they always demand profound leadership. Looking at this long arc of history leaves us with one critical question to ponder. As global competition and internal divisions continue to rise, how will future presidents face the next great inevitable crisis? Thank you so much for joining me to explore the history of the presidency. Keep learning and keep questioning.